That night, the most powerful man in the underworld stood in his room and trembled. Not from bullets, not from enemies, but because the woman he considered the shadow behind his throne had quietly packed her bags and walked out of his life forever. Don Cassian Moretti, the man feared by the entire underworld, never understood that the silent woman beside him was the sole foundation keeping his empire standing. By the time he understood, it was too late. Like and comment with the name of the city you're viewing from, so I know how far this story has progressed. The estate sat 3 kilometers outside the city, behind iron gates that had never once been forced open. 12 years of that. 12 years of men dying on the other side of those gates, rather than attempting what everyone knew was suicide. The Moretti compound was the kind of place that didn't appear on commercial maps. The kind of place where the silence itself had weight, where even the guards moved carefully because noise felt like a violation of something older and darker than any rule Cassian had ever written down. He had built it that way deliberately. The gravel on the drive was raked each morning before dawn. The hedgerows were cut to exact measurements. The fountain in the east courtyard ran on a timer so precise that the head groundskeeper had once told a new hire it was synchronized to the dawn's heartbeat. The man had been joking. The new hire hadn't laughed. Nobody laughed at jokes like that inside the Moretti walls. It was a Thursday evening in early November when everything ended. Cassian had been in the city most of the day, a long meeting with his logistics directors that had gone 3 hours past its scheduled close, because 2 of his senior men couldn't agree on the routing of a shipment through the northern ports. He'd sat at the head of the table through all of it, not saying much, letting them argue, watching the way each man's eyes moved when the other spoke. He'd learned more about loyalty from watching eyes during arguments than from any oath ever sworn in his presence. By the time the meeting broke up, the light was already gone from the sky, and his driver had the car idling at the curb before Cassian reached the bottom step. He didn't speak on the ride home. He rarely did. Marco, his driver of 9 years, understood this and kept the privacy screen up without being asked. Cassian leaned against the window and watched the city lights slide past and thought about nothing in particular, which was as close to peace as he ever got. Isabella was supposed to be in Geneva. She'd left 6 days ago for what she described as a series of investment consultations, the kind of vague professional framing she'd used for years and that Cassian had long since stopped questioning. She handled her own affairs. He'd always appreciated that about her. The absence of need. The self-sufficiency that meant she never appeared in his office doorway with problems that required his attention. She was 41 years old, composed in the way of someone who had survived things they never discussed, and she had been his wife for 11 years. He hadn't thought about her once during the drive home. The car turned through the main gate at 9:47 p.m. The gravel crunched. The fountain in the east courtyard caught the headlights for a moment, and then the car curved around toward the main entrance, and Cassian saw that the lights in the master suite were on, which was unusual because the staff didn't use those rooms. He didn't think much of it. He told Marco to garage the car, took his jacket from the back seat, and walked through the front entrance without hurrying. Benedetto, the house manager, appeared from the east corridor with an expression that Cassian couldn't immediately read. Not alarm, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something carefully suppressed. "Signora Moretti returned this afternoon," Benedetto said, "earlier than expected." Cassian stopped. "Is she unwell?" "She appeared—" Benedetto paused in a way that was half a second too long. "She appeared quite composed, sir." He took the stairs. He didn't know why the pause bothered him. Benedetto was a careful man, a man who chose words deliberately, and the pause had sat in the middle of a sentence where no pause was needed. Cassian walked the upper corridor with his jacket over one arm, his footsteps quiet on the runner, and he pushed open the double doors to the master suite. The room smelled of a perfume he didn't recognize. Valentina was sitting at Isabella's vanity table. She was 29, with dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing a silk robe that Cassian had bought her 3 months ago from a boutique in Milan. She had her head tilted slightly to one side, fastening something at her ear, and she looked up at his reflection in the mirror with a smile that stopped functioning the instant she registered his expression, because Isabella was standing on the far side of the room. She was still wearing her travel clothes, a charcoal wool coat, dark trousers, low heels. Her carry-on bag was on the floor beside her. She hadn't removed her coat. She hadn't put anything down. She had the look of someone who had walked into a room, processed what was inside it, and then gone very, very still. Cassian's brain ran the sequence in under 2 seconds. The timeline reconstructed itself without effort. He had not known Valentina would be here tonight. He had not authorized her presence in the main house. He had never brought her inside the walls of the estate. Not once. That had been a line he'd maintained with something close to discipline. And now she was here, sitting at his wife's vanity table, fastening something at her ear, and Isabella was standing 7 meters away wearing her coat because she had just arrived and had not yet had time to leave. He looked at Valentina's ear. The earring was a small diamond drop, old-fashioned setting, the kind of piece that didn't come from a boutique, the kind of piece that came from a family. Isabella's mother had died 4 years ago. She had left almost nothing material behind. She had not been a woman of means, but she had left 3 pieces of jewelry, a thin gold chain, a garnet ring that Isabella wore on her right hand every day, and a pair of diamond drop earrings that had been in the family for 2 generations and that lived in a locked box inside Isabella's private dressing room. Cassian understood, in a single moment, exactly how badly he had miscalculated. Not the affair, not even the presence of Valentina inside the estate. The earrings, the locked box. The fact that someone had gone into Isabella's private dressing room and removed something that did not belong to them and had not been offered and had put it on and was sitting at Isabella's vanity table wearing it when Isabella walked through the door. He opened his mouth. Isabella turned and walked out of the room. No sound, no slammed door, no sharp intake of breath. She simply turned, picked up her carry-on bag with one hand, and walked through the doors of the master suite with the same deliberate composure she might have used to exit a business meeting that had run slightly past schedule. Cassian said, "Valentina, get out." She started to speak. He said it again, quieter, and she stopped speaking and found her clothes and left without looking at him. He stood alone in the master suite for a moment, then followed Isabella. She was not in the corridor. She was not in any of the rooms on the upper floor. He found her in the study on the ground floor, the small room off the east corridor that she used for her own work, the room he almost never entered because its contents were hers entirely. She was standing at the desk, and she was writing something, or not writing. She was signing something, he realized, a pen moving across the bottom of a document, and the movement was unhurried. She finished signing. She put the pen down. She picked up her wedding ring from the desk where it was already resting. He hadn't even seen her remove it. And she placed it on top of the document with a precision that looked practiced. Then she looked at him. Cassian Moretti was 53 years old. He had been shot twice, stabbed once, had survived a car bombing in his 30s that had killed 2 men sitting within arm's reach of him. He had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and made them blink first every single time. He was not a man who felt the ground move under his feet. The ground moved. "Isabella, the papers were filed with our attorney 3 weeks ago," she said. "This copy is yours. The process is already in motion." Her voice was the temperature of the room, not cold with anger, which would have been something he could have met and matched. Just even. Level. The voice of someone who had already completed an internal process he'd had no visibility into. He looked at the document on the desk. He recognized the format. Divorce papers. The signature at the bottom was hers. "You had these prepared 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." Before Geneva. Geneva was not a business consultation. She picked up her carry-on bag again. She hadn't unpacked. She wasn't going to. "I've had the documents ready for some time. I was waiting to be certain I had everything in order before I finalized anything." "Everything in order," he repeated. The phrase landed wrong, had a weight to it that he couldn't immediately locate. "What does that mean?" "It means what it says." She moved toward the door. He stepped to the side, not blocking her, but close. "We need to talk about this." "We don't." She stopped, looked at him directly. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she had done with the feeling, she had done it somewhere he couldn't see. "There is nothing to negotiate, Cassian. I'm not angry. I'm not asking for explanations. I'm leaving." "Over this." He heard how it sounded as he said it, and he saw from her face that she heard it too. The faint suggestion that this was a proportionate response to an exaggerated problem. Not over this evening, she said quietly. This evening is simply the last in a long sequence of evenings I've been accounting for. She held his eyes for a moment. The earrings were my mother's. He didn't have anything to say to that. There was no version of a response that functioned. She walked out. He stayed in the doorway of the study and listened to her footsteps on the tile, then the brief sound of the front entrance, then nothing. He walked to the window that looked out over the front drive. The Pagani was already at the gate. He'd heard of the car before he saw it. An all-black Pagani Huayra Codalunga, one of 5 produced, one of the most restricted automobiles ever commissioned, the kind of acquisition that required connections preceding any conversation about price. He had tried to acquire one 2 years ago through 3 separate channels and had been told each time that every example was already spoken for, privately reserved, not available. He'd accepted this the way he accepted very few things, as simply beyond his reach. The car sat in his drive with its engine at idle, a sound so low and precise it was almost inaudible through the glass. One of his own security men opened the gate without being asked, as if the request had already been made and already been approved. Isabella put her carry-on in the car. She didn't look back at the house. The gate closed after the Pagani disappeared. It closed with the same mechanical precision it always did, the same timing, the same sound. Cassian stood at the window with his jacket still over one arm and watched the empty drive and felt the first distant edge of something he couldn't name yet, but would spend the next 48 hours learning to call by its right name. He went back to the study. He stood at the desk and looked at the divorce papers and the ring and the pen she'd left beside them. He picked up the ring. It was lighter than he expected, though he'd seen it on her hand for 11 years and had no logical reason to expect anything particular about its weight. He put it back down. He went to his own office at the north end of the house and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and sat at his desk and did not drink it. He pulled up his phone and found no messages requiring immediate attention. He set the phone face down. The estate was quiet, in the particular way it got after midnight, a managed quiet. The guards making their rounds, the cameras running their cycles, everything functioning exactly as it was supposed to. He thought about calling Benedetto to ask how long Valentina had been in the house. He decided against it. The answer wouldn't improve anything. He thought about calling his attorney. He picked up the phone, set it down again. At 1:15 in the morning, a message arrived from Luca Ferrante, his head of financial security, flagged urgent. Cassian read it twice before his understanding fully assembled around what it was telling him. Then he read it a 3rd time. The message described an anomaly discovered during a routine audit of the syndicate's corporate holding structure, a cascade of ownership registrations that Luca's team had followed through 4 layers of shell companies before arriving at a name they didn't recognize. The name appeared again at the controlling level of a second holding entity. And a 3rd. Luca's message described the team's attempt to identify the individual behind the name and the results of that attempt, and it ended with a single question that Cassian could see had cost Luca something to type. Sir, is the name Isabella Val Moretti known to you in this context? Cassian sat with the message on the screen for a long time. He typed back, come to the house at 6, bring everything. He put the phone on the desk. He looked at the untouched whiskey. Outside, through the north-facing window, the sky was beginning to gray at the horizon's edge. He had not slept. He was not going to sleep. He thought about the Pagani in his drive, the low idle of that engine, the way the gate had opened without hesitation. He thought about the word Benedetto had not completed. She appeared quite, and the pause where the right word should have been. He thought about what it meant that his wife had returned from a trip he'd understood to be professional, found her dead mother's jewelry on another woman's ears inside the bedroom they'd shared for 11 years, signed a document that had been prepared weeks in advance, and driven away in the one automobile on Earth that Cassian Moretti had wanted and been told he could never have. And he started, very slowly, to understand that the evening had not ended the way he'd thought it had. It had not ended at all. By morning, 3 more messages had arrived from senior members of his organization. Each one described a different anomaly. Each one, when Cassian traced it back through the corporate architecture he'd believed he understood completely, arrived at the same name. By the time Luca walked through the north entrance at 6:15 with 2 of his analysts and a briefcase of documents, Cassian had already begun to understand the shape of what he was looking at. But understanding the shape of something and accepting what it means are two separate things. And for another hour, he sat across the desk from Luca and listened and asked precise, controlled questions and kept his face exactly where he needed it to be. It was when Luca said carefully, "Sir, the offshore trust accounts, the primary reserve structures, we believe the signatory authority rests with," that Cassian held up one hand. Luca stopped. The room was quiet. "How long?" Cassian said. Luca looked at the document in front of him. "The earliest registration we've traced is 9 years ago. But given the layering, we believe the structure has been in place considerably longer than that. 9 years ago, he and Isabella had been married for 2 years. Cassian lowered his hand to the desk. He did not allow his expression to change. He looked at the middle distance and thought about 11 years of evenings. 11 years of a woman who handled her own affairs and never needed anything from him and never complained about the things she must have known and never once, not once, had appeared in his doorway with a problem she couldn't solve herself. He thought about the locked box in her dressing room. He thought about the earrings. And for the first time since the gate had closed behind the Pagani, the dawn of the Moretti Syndicate felt something that was entirely new to him. A cold, precise, spreading recognition that the empire he had believed was his had been held together, all along, by hands he'd never once thought to look at. The whiskey was still on the desk in his office, still untouched. He was going to need it. Luca left at 8:15 with his analysts and his briefcase and a list of follow-up tasks that Cassian had dictated in a flat, unhurried voice that none of them could read. The north entrance closed behind them. The house went quiet again. Cassian sat at his desk. The whiskey was warm now, the ice long dissolved, the glass sweating a ring onto the leather desk pad that his housekeeper would notice and blot away without comment. He picked up the glass for the first time and drank half of it and put it back down and looked at the documents Luca had left behind, 40-odd pages of corporate registrations, ownership charts, signatory records, laid out across the desk in the careful arrangement of a man who understood that his employer needed to absorb information without having to search for it. Cassian was a precise reader. He went through the documents twice, slowly, making no marks, asking no questions to the empty room. The picture assembled itself in his mind the way intelligence always did. Not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something the body had already processed while the conscious mind was still catching up. Isabella Valimoretti appeared as the ultimate beneficial owner of 6 corporate structures. Through those 6 structures, she held controlling interest in the 3 shipping companies that moved the syndicate's legitimate freight and provided cover for its less documented cargo. She held the master lease on the Porto Levante facility, which meant the syndicate's primary northern distribution point operated at her discretion. She was the named signatory on the reserve accounts of 2 offshore trusts, accounts that Cassian had believed were controlled by a Liechtenstein law firm acting on his instructions. The law firm, it turned out, acted on hers. It was not theft. That was the part that kept snagging in his thinking. None of it was theft in any sense he could prosecute or even argue cleanly. Every structure had been built with his tacit approval, often with his direct participation, because he had signed documents put in front of him by attorneys he trusted, and those documents had contained the names of entities he hadn't examined closely because he'd had other things to examine, because the machine had been running smoothly, because when a machine runs smoothly, a man stops looking at its parts. He finished the whiskey. He called Enzo Battaglia at 8:40. Enzo was 61, his longest-serving capo, a man who had been present at the table when Cassian took over the syndicate from his father 22 years ago. If anyone in the organization was going to give him an unfiltered answer, it was Enzo. The phone rang 4 times before Enzo picked up. "I need you at the house," Cassian said. A pause. Shorter than Benedito's pause the night before, but carrying the same texture. Not surprise exactly, but the sound of a man rearranging his face before he spoke. "I can be there by 10, Enzo said. "Be here by 9:30. He hung up. He called his attorney, Stefano Carvelli, and got voicemail and left a message asking Stefano to call as soon as possible regarding the corporate holding audit. He called his head of security, a Sardinian named Drago, who had worked for the Moretti family since before Cassian's father died, and asked him to locate the originals of every lease agreement and financial authorization signed in the last 12 years that involved entities other than the syndicate's primary holding company. Drago said, "That's a considerable volume of documents, sir. I'm aware. Some of those may be held by—" Drago stopped. "By whom?" Another pause. "There may be some categorized under Signora Moretti's private filing system. We've always accessed those through her personal administrator." Cassian held the phone very still against his ear. "Who is her personal administrator?" "A woman named Chiara Russo. She works from an office in the city. She's been with the Signora for—" Drago paused again, this time calculating. "I believe approximately 7 years." "Get me a number for Chiara Russo." "Yes, sir." He put the phone down. He looked out the north window at the gray morning. The fountain in the east courtyard was running. He could hear it faintly, the same rhythm it always kept. He thought about the head groundskeeper saying it was synchronized to his heartbeat, and he thought the man had been more right than he knew, except the timing had never been Cassian's. Enzo arrived at 9:22, which meant he'd been in his car already when Cassian called. That was interesting. Cassian noted it and said nothing about it. He poured coffee from the service on the side table and set a cup in front of Enzo and sat across from him and let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. "How long have you known?" Cassian said. Enzo's hands were around the coffee cup. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had absorbed decades of difficult information without flinching. He looked at Cassian steadily, and Cassian watched him calculate, watched him weigh the cost of different answers against each other. "Known what specifically?" Enzo said. "Don't." Enzo set the cup down. He breathed in through his nose and out slowly, and he said, "I had suspicions, not knowledge, not documentation. I noticed over the years that certain things ran through Isabella's office that I would have expected to run through yours. I assumed—" He stopped. "I assumed you had arranged it that way deliberately." "Why would I have arranged it that way?" "Because it was efficient." Enzo's voice was even, not defensive. "Because Isabella was extremely capable, and you trusted her, and the machine worked. Nobody asks why a machine works, Cassian. You know this." Cassian looked at him. "Did anyone else suspect?" "Probably." Enzo picked up the coffee again. "Ferrante, maybe. He's sharp with numbers, but if he suspected, he would have assumed the same thing I did, that it was intentional." "It was intentional," Cassian said. "Just not mine." The room was quiet for a moment. "What happened last night?" Enzo said. Not a question exactly. More like a man trying to locate the coordinates of a disaster after the fact. Cassian told him. He told it plainly, without editorializing, the way he would have reported intelligence to a trusted advisor. Valentina in the master suite. The earrings. The divorce papers already signed, already filed. The Pagani at the gate. Enzo listened without interrupting. When Cassian finished, Enzo was quiet for a long moment, and then he said very carefully, "The earrings were Elena's." "Yes, Isabella's mother." "Yes, Enzo, I know who Elena was." "I'm not—" Enzo stopped, reset. "I'm saying that whoever put those earrings on that woman understood exactly what they were doing. That wasn't carelessness, Cassian. Someone brought that woman into this house and gave her Elena's earrings. Either Valentina found them herself and took them, or someone gave them to her." Cassian hadn't gotten there yet. He sat with it for a moment. The locked box? The private dressing room? Valentina was 29 and ambitious in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet learned that ambition without intelligence is just acceleration toward a wall. She was not, in his assessment, the kind of person who found a locked box, acquired the means to open it, identified the significance of the contents, and made a deliberate choice to put them on. Someone had helped her, or someone had put them on her without her fully understanding what they were. "Find out how she got into the house," Cassian said. "Find out who let her in and how she accessed the dressing room. Don't discuss it with anyone else until you've talked to me." Enzo nodded. He stood, buttoned his jacket, picked up his coffee, and finished it standing. "And the corporate situation? I'm handling it. If word gets out to the other families, it won't get out if my people don't talk." Enzo gave him a look that communicated without words that Enzo had been in this business long enough to know that things always got out, and that the question was never whether but when. He left without saying it. Cassian's phone buzzed at 10:15. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize, which was unusual enough that he opened it before his system could flag it. The message contained 3 words and a callback number. "Call me. Isabella." He stared at it, then he called. She picked up on the second ring. "Thank you for calling." The voice was the same, composed even, the temperature of a room she controlled. He could hear ambient sound behind her. A city somewhere, traffic, an interior space that echoed slightly. "Where are you?" he said. "That's not relevant." "Isabella." "I'm calling because I want to be fair," she said. "I want you to have information before you start making moves that will cost you more than they need to. Not because I owe you anything, because I'd rather you understand the situation accurately than spend the next 2 weeks doing damage trying to untangle something that doesn't untangle the way you think it does." He kept his voice flat. "I'm listening. The structures Luca found are the ones he was going to find. There are others he won't find as quickly. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. The assets we're discussing were built with legitimate capital and registered appropriately at every step. You will not find anything that supports a claim of fraud or misappropriation. What you'll find, if you look long enough, is that a significant portion of the financial infrastructure of the Moretti Syndicate has been organized and maintained through entities I control. You're explaining to me what I already know." "I'm explaining to you that it stays organized," she said. "Nothing is being dismantled. The accounts are operational. The leases are current. The shipping contracts are in force. I'm not interested in destroying what I spent years building. I'm interested in leaving. And the divorce is already in process." A pause. "You'll want to cooperate with it, not for my sake, for the sake of the transition." The word landed with precision. Transition. As if the departure of his wife from the Moretti Empire was an administrative event, a handoff, something to be managed rather than contested. "Who else knows," he said, "about the structures?" "About all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Several people have had reason to suspect over the years. I've been careful about what they could confirm, but Cassian," her voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but closer to something honest. "The Seven Families Summit is in 9 days. I'd strongly suggest you get your position settled before then." "What does the summit have to do with you?" She didn't answer that. She said, "Cooperate with the divorce. Don't send anyone to find me. Don't freeze the accounts. You don't have the standing to, but attempting it will create a situation that benefits neither of us." A pause. "I'll have Chiara reach out to your attorney about the transition documentation." Isabella. He hadn't meant to say it the way he did. Not with that particular quality in his voice, the thing he hadn't intended to expose. "Was any of it? Don't ask me that," she said quietly. "You don't actually want the answer." She hung up. Cassian sat with the phone in his hand for almost a minute. The fountain ran in the east courtyard. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the north wing, a door closed. He called Stefano Carvelli. This time Stefano picked up immediately, and the speed of his answer suggested he'd been waiting for the call, which was its own kind of information. "I need to understand my legal position regarding the corporate structures Luca Ferrante has been auditing," Cassian said. Stefano's pause was longer than anyone else's had been. "I was expecting your call," he said, which was not the same as saying he was glad for it. "Cassian, some of what Luca's team has uncovered, I need to be transparent with you about the fact that certain documents passed through my office in the course of normal transaction processing that I did not examine as carefully as I would have had I—" "Stefano?" "Yes." "Are you telling me you signed documents for her?" "In the context of what I understood to be your joint interests, Yes. Over the years, certain authorizations that I believed represented your joint decision-making were executed through my office." "How many?" Another pause. "I would need to compile a full accounting. The number is not small." Cassian closed his eyes for 3 seconds. He opened them. "Compile it. Send it to me today." And Stefano, his voice dropped. If I find out that you knew the full picture and made a decision about whose interests you were serving, that conversation will happen in person. Stefano said, "Understood," in the voice of a man who understood very clearly. He spent the rest of the morning making calls he didn't want to make. By noon, he had a shape of the situation that was more complete and considerably worse than what Luca had presented at 6 in the morning. The offshore trust accounts represented the syndicate's primary financial reserve, the accumulated capital of 2 decades of operations, held in structures that Isabella's signature controlled. The Porto Levante facility was the linchpin of the northern operation, and its lease ran under her name for another 4 years with no buyout clause. The security network contract, covering armored vehicles, personnel, communications, had been renewed 18 months ago under a services agreement signed by an entity she controlled, which meant that even Drago's people were technically operating under her authorization. He was not broke. He was not exposed. The operations were running, the money was moving, the men were at their posts. But the architecture beneath all of it was hers, and dismantling it would require either her cooperation or a legal process that would take years and expose structures better, left unexamined by courts. His first call that afternoon was to Ronaldo Fausto, the oldest Don among the 7 families, a man of 70 who had known Cassian's father and who operated with a deliberate slowness that concealed an intelligence Cassian had always respected. Ronaldo picked up himself, which was unusual. "I was going to call you," Ronaldo said. Cassian didn't like the sound of that. "About what?" "The summit agenda?" A pause, careful and weighted. "There have been some conversations among the families in the last day or so about the format of the summit, about who will be presenting the expansion proposal." "I'm presenting." "Yes." Ronaldo's voice was the tone of a man who was about to say something that required precision. "There have been some questions raised about the readiness of the Moretti position, given recent developments." Cassian's grip on the phone tightened. "What recent developments?" "Cassian." Ronaldo said his name with the patience of someone who had decided to be kind about an unkind thing. In our world, when a man's house develops significant administrative complications, word moves. I'm not the source of any conversation, but I would be failing in my respect for your father's memory if I didn't tell you that the questions are being asked. Who's asking? Most of them, Ronaldo said simply. The question being asked most often is whether the Moretti proposal should be tabled until the internal situation is resolved. There is no internal situation. A pause. Cassian. He stopped. He breathed. He made himself use the discipline he'd spent 30 years building. I appreciate the call, Ronaldo. Come and see me before the summit, the old man said. Before the others. A pause. And Cassian, I would suggest you think carefully about what you intend to walk into that room with in 9 days. Walking in with less than you believe you have would be considerably more dangerous than not walking in at all. The line closed. Cassian stood at the north window. The sky had gone flat and gray, the kind of November sky that had no horizon, that just pressed down. He could see the tree line at the edge of the property, everything inside the gate, everything he could see from here, the grounds, the fountain, the east courtyard wall, all of it was on land held in a trust. He called Drago. The earrings, he said. Who let Valentina into the house? Drago was quiet for a moment. I've been going through the access logs, he said. The gate entry on the night in question was authorized by a key card registered to... Another pause, this one different. The pause of a man reading something he's surprised to be reading. It's registered to a staff member who left the Moretti household 6 weeks ago, a driver named Piero Santi. Santi left 6 weeks ago. Yes. His card should have been deactivated upon departure. It wasn't. Who is responsible for deactivating cards when staff depart? That falls under the household security protocol, which is administered through... Drago stopped. He stopped in a specific way, the way a man stops when he has arrived at a door and understood what's on the other side of it without opening it yet. The household security protocol is administered through the same services agreement that runs under her authorization, Cassian said. Yes, sir. The silence that followed had a texture Cassian couldn't recall encountering before. Not rage. He'd felt rage and knew its shape. Something colder. Something with more geometry to it. Valentina had gotten into the house on a deactivated card belonging to a former employee. The card should have been killed 6 weeks ago. It hadn't been, because the system that should have killed it was answering, ultimately, to a contract Isabella controlled. Whether she had allowed the card to stay active deliberately, whether she had known what was coming, whether she had engineered the exact moment of her own discovery. He couldn't know that. He might never know it. But he knew that the gate had opened, and he knew that she had been standing on the other side of it, in her coat, with her bag, with papers already signed and a car already waiting, and he knew that she had not looked surprised. He was still at the window when his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Marco Vitali, his capo responsible for the Eastern financial relationships. The message was brief and used the kind of careful, displaced language that meant it was reporting something Marco didn't want to say plainly on a line that might be monitored. Called to set up the Brightman meeting. Was told they need sign-off from the primary contact before any new arrangements can be discussed. Asked who the primary contact is. They told me. Cassian read it twice. The Brightman Group was a private bank in Zurich that had handled the syndicate's European financial relationships for 11 years. 11 years. The relationship predated Isabella's involvement in syndicate affairs by, he thought about it, by almost nothing. By perhaps 6 months. He typed back, say nothing. Come to the house tomorrow morning. He set the phone on the windowsill and looked at the tree line. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was one he recognized. Dante Ricci, 47 years old, the youngest of the 7 family heads. A man who had built his position through aggression and who had made no particular secret of his view that the Moretti Syndicate's dominant position in the Northern Territories was a historical accident rather than a permanent condition. Cassian let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 20 seconds later, a text arrived. Heard about your situation. Happy to talk if you need a friend. D. Cassian looked at the message. He thought about what Ronaldo had said. Most of them. He thought about 9 days. He thought about a summit table where every Don in the room had spent decades waiting for the first sign that the Moretti position was something other than unassailable. He did not respond to Dante's message. He went back to the desk and sat down and looked at the documents and the untouched second glass of whiskey and the ring still on the leather pad where he'd put it back down that morning. The diamond caught the flat gray light from the window and threw nothing back. He thought about what Isabella had said on the phone. Get your position settled before then. Not a threat. Not gloating. The voice of someone who had already decided what they were doing and was extending, out of something he couldn't characterize, a courtesy warning. He thought about the summit. 9 days. He thought about walking into a room of 7 of the most dangerous men in the world, while the financial architecture of his empire was controlled by a woman who had just driven away in the car he'd always wanted and was not coming back. And then his phone rang again, and this time it was a number he didn't recognize at all. And when he answered it, the voice on the other end was female and professional and said, Mr. Moretti, my name is Chiara Russo. I'm calling on behalf of Isabella. She asked me to reach out regarding the transition documentation. A pause. She also asked me to tell you that the summit location has been changed. The hosting family has agreed to a different venue. Another pause, shorter. She'll be attending. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, Cassian said. His voice was perfectly controlled. Could you repeat that? Isabella will be attending the 7 Families Summit, Chiara Russo said in the tone of someone reading from a document. As an independent party, the hosting family has confirmed her invitation. A pause. She wanted you to hear it from her office rather than through the families. She thought that was more respectful. Cassian held the phone against his ear and said nothing for a long moment. Thank you, he said finally. For the call. He ended it. He put the phone down. He looked at the window, at the gray sky, at the tree line standing dark and still at the edge of everything he owned and did not own. 9 days. She was going to walk into that room. He stood up from the desk with enough force that the chair rolled back and struck the credenza behind him. He walked to the window and stood there with one hand against the frame. breathing through his nose, slow and deliberate, the way he'd trained himself to breathe when the thing in front of him was too large to meet with anything but control. The frame was cold under his palm. Outside, the fountain ran its indifferent cycle. He had built this. That was the thought that kept arriving, the one he couldn't route around. He had built the Moretti Syndicate from his father's wreckage, had spent 22 years expanding it, protecting it, making it into something that the other families looked at and didn't challenge. He had done that with his own hands, with his own judgment, with the particular combination of patience and violence that the work required. He had believed that utterly. It had been the one thing he was certain of. And somewhere inside that certainty, while he was looking outward at threats that came with faces and weapons and identifiable intentions, the woman who slept beside him had been quietly building something of her own, not against him, not exactly, but around him, the way a structure is built around a load-bearing wall that doesn't know it isn't holding anything up. He pushed away from the window. He needed information he didn't have, and there was only one person left who might give it to him without a calculated pause before every sentence. He went to the east corridor and down to the end where a smaller room served as the household's secondary office, a room Isabella had sometimes used when she wanted to work without the formality of her city office. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. A desk, clean, shelving with binders labeled in her handwriting, dates going back years. A printer. A small safe built into the lower cabinet, locked. Combination he didn't know. He called Drago back. The safe in the east office. Can your people open it without destroying it? A pause. Yes. Do it. He went back to his own office and waited. While he waited, he called two more capos, Fredo Mancini, who handled the southern port relationships, and Angelo Sede, who oversaw the syndicate's construction fronts. He asked each of them the same question in slightly different forms, and each of them gave him answers that added detail to the same picture. Financial authorizations running through entities neither of them had fully examined. Contracts renewed under signatory names they'd assumed were Cassian's designates. In Fredo's case, a shipping amendment from 3 years ago that had rerouted a significant portion of the southern operation through a logistics company that Fredo had believed was syndicate-owned. Who told you it was syndicate-owned? Cassian asked. Fredo was quiet. It was presented as part of the restructure. I assumed it had your approval. Who presented it? It came through legal, through Carvelli's office. Cassian closed his eyes briefly. Carvelli, who had signed documents he hadn't examined carefully, who had been in his employ for 14 years and who had, apparently, developed a secondary set of loyalties so gradually and so cleanly that it had never registered as a problem until the morning after the whole thing came apart. He ended the call with Fredo. He sat with his hands flat on the desk. The thing that was building inside him was not panic. He had no template for panic, had never learned the shape of it, had spent his adult life in situations that would have reduced other men to it, and had simply found other resources. What was building was something more structural, a cold, expanding recognition that the problem in front of him was not one he could solve with the tools that had solved every other problem he'd encountered. You couldn't shoot your way out of a corporate ownership structure. You couldn't intimidate a balance sheet. You couldn't send men to a Zurich bank and explain to the compliance officer, with the particular quality of persuasion that worked in other contexts, that the signatory authority needed to be reassigned. These were not the weapons of his world. They were the weapons of hers. Drago appeared in the doorway of the north office at 2 in the afternoon. He was holding a folder. The safe, he said. There wasn't much, some personal documents, some correspondence. He set the folder on the desk. And this. He placed a second item on top of the folder, a small leather-bound notebook, dark green, the kind that could have been purchased at any stationer's. Cassian looked at it without touching it for a moment. Is that hers? He said. Her handwriting on the inside cover, Drago said. I didn't read past that. Cassian picked it up after Drago left. He opened it to the inside cover. Her handwriting, small, precise, the letters slightly compressed the way they always were, said simply, IV? Private. Below that, a date. 7 years ago. He turned to the first page. It was not a diary. It was closer to an operational log. Dates, names, numbers, brief notations in a shorthand that took him a few pages to begin decoding. He recognized some of the names. Others he'd never encountered. The numbers, as he worked through the first section, began to resolve into transaction amounts, account references, corporate entity names. He sat at his desk and read for an hour without stopping. The coffee went cold. The gray light outside shifted and flattened further toward evening. He read with the focused stillness of a man who has stopped needing to defend himself against information because the information has already arrived, and the only remaining choice is how clearly he sees it. What the notebook documented, across 7 years of careful entries, was the construction of the financial architecture that Luca had begun to map that morning. But it also documented something else, something Luca's audit wouldn't have found because it wasn't in the corporate structures. It was in the names, the families, all 7 of them. Notations beside each name, dates of contact, subjects discussed, outcomes of conversations. Not transactions, not bribes, nothing so crude. The notes described, in her compressed shorthand, the interventions she'd made on behalf of the syndicate in disputes that had never officially reached Cassian's desk. A conflict between the Ricci family and a competing operation in the South, resolved through a financing arrangement Isabella had quietly structured. A succession crisis in the Ferrara family 3 years ago that had threatened to destabilize the Northern Alliance. Notations in the book described 3 separate conversations Isabella had conducted with the relevant parties over 6 weeks, at the end of which the crisis had resolved in a manner that benefited the Moretti position. He had known nothing about any of it. He had received the outcomes, the stabilized alliance, the resolved conflict, and had attributed them to his own reputation, to the weight of the Moretti name, to the simple deterrent effect of being the largest and most feared organization at the table. He had accepted credit for a piece he hadn't made. He closed the notebook. He sat without moving for a long time. The call from Ronaldo came back to him. Most of them. The families had been asking questions, Ronaldo had said, about the Moretti position. And now he sat with a notebook in his hands that documented years of relationship management, years of his wife serving as the invisible diplomatic infrastructure of his empire. And he understood that when those families answered her calls before his, it was not because of the corporate structures. It was because of this. Because she had been present in their crises in ways he hadn't known about, and they had not forgotten it. He thought about the summit in 9 days. He thought about her voice on the phone. She'll be attending, as an independent party. He stood, walked to the window, stood there. The east courtyard fountain, the darkening tree line, the lights beginning to come on in the gatehouse at the far end of the drive. His phone rang. He picked it up without looking, expecting Luca or Enzo, and the voice that answered was Valentina's. He hadn't spoken to her since the night before. He'd sent her out of the house and given no further instructions, which in retrospect had been its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't yet understood she was asking. "Cassian," she said. Her voice was careful, calibrated, aimed at something. "Now is not a good time," he said. "I need to know what's happening." A pause. "I've been hearing things. From people I know. About the business situation. About Isabella." Her voice dropped slightly on the name, a deliberate effect, and he heard it for exactly what it was. A woman who had calculated that this moment, this particular instability, might represent an opening, and who hadn't yet understood that the instability was precisely the reason she had no leverage at all. "What people?" he said. "People in the circle. People who pay attention." A pause. "Dante Ricci's people have been asking questions about the Moretti finances, about who actually controls Valentina." His voice was quiet. "Stop talking." She stopped. "Who have you spoken to in the last 24 hours about anything related to the syndicate's financial structure?" Silence. Then, carefully, "I haven't said anything specific. People have been asking, and I told them I didn't have information, but who asked you?" One of Dante's associates reached out this morning. He seemed to already know quite a lot. He was just... She stopped again, processing something. "He was just asking me to confirm." Cassian said nothing for a moment. He breathed through it. Dante Ricci. 47 years old, ambitious, patient in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for a specific window to open, who had texted Cassian that afternoon offering to be a friend, who had apparently, simultaneously, been asking Valentina to confirm financial intelligence. "Don't speak to anyone connected to the Ricci family again," Cassian said. "Don't speak to anyone connected to any of the families. Don't speak to anyone about the syndicate's finances, structure, or internal situation in any context. Do you understand?" "Cassian, I was trying to—" "Do you understand?" A pause. "Yes." He ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand and thought about what Valentina had just told him without intending to. That Dante Ricci had moved fast, had already positioned assets, had already begun probing the edges of what he could confirm before the summit. Which meant Dante had known something was coming, which meant the information had moved faster and from more sources than Cassian had accounted for. He called Enzo. "The earrings," he said when Enzo picked up. "You asked whether Valentina found them herself or whether someone helped her. I need you to find out, specifically, whether anyone connected to Dante Ricci had any contact with Valentina in the 6 weeks before last night." A pause. Not a calculating pause this time. A grim one. "You think Ricci set it up?" "I think someone helped Valentina into a locked room wearing a dead woman's jewelry on the one evening Isabella was guaranteed to walk through that door. I think the timing of that is not coincidental. And I think Dante sent me a message this afternoon calling himself my friend." He paused. "Find out." He put the phone down. He went back to the desk. He opened the notebook again to a page near the middle, a page with Dante Ricci's name at the top. The notation beside it was dated 2 years ago, 8 words in Isabella's shorthand, and Cassian spent a moment translating them before the meaning assembled itself. R.D. Approached. Offer declined. File kept. He knows. He read it 3 times, then he read what came after it, a secondary notation 2 months later. Position unchanged. DR aware of terms, no further contact. He sat back. She had known. 2 years ago, Dante Ricci had approached her with something, an offer, an overture, something she'd declined. And she had kept a file, and she had noted that he knew the terms of her refusal, and there had been no further contact. Until last night. Cassian picked up the notebook and held it, and looked at the far wall of the office. The room was dark now, except for the desk lamp. Outside, the estate lights had come on, the perimeter illumination casting its usual cold wash across the drive. In 9 days, Isabella Vale was going to walk into a room with the 7 family heads. She was going to walk in with 11 years of relationship management behind her, with financial control of the largest criminal empire in the Northern Territories, with a notebook of documented interventions that had kept 3 separate family conflicts from becoming wars, and with whatever she had on Dante Ricci that had made him back down 2 years ago and had apparently caused him to spend the intervening time engineering a different approach. And Cassian was going to walk into the same room with a diminished empire, a compromised attorney, a mistress who had been talking to the wrong people, and the growing certainty that the narrative of who had built the Moretti Syndicate was about to be told in that room by someone other than him, in a version he had never heard before and could not counter with anything except his own blind confidence in a story that the notebook in his hands had just taken apart page by careful page. He set the notebook on the desk beside the ring and the divorce papers and the cold whiskey. He looked at all of it together, and he finally, fully, allowed himself to understand what the summit in 9 days actually was. Not his expansion proposal, not his consolidation of power, not the moment the Moretti name was written permanently into the architecture of the underworld's next decade. It was a trial. And the woman he had underestimated for 11 years was going to be the one standing at the front of the room. He slept 3 hours. Not because he allowed himself the rest, but because his body made the decision without consulting him. He was at the desk at some point past midnight, reading through Luca's documents for the 3rd time, and then he was waking up in the chair with gray morning light coming through the north window and his neck at an angle that would make itself known for the rest of the day. He sat up. The notebook was still open on the desk. The ring was still there. He had 7 days. The first thing he did was call Enzo, who picked up on the first ring, which meant Enzo hadn't slept either. Cassian told him to assemble the 4 most senior capos at the estate by noon. not a request. Enzo said he'd have them there by 11:30. The second thing he did was call Stefano Carvelli and fire him. Stefano tried to speak. Cassian said, "Send everything to my office by end of day. Every document, every authorization, every correspondence file going back 14 years. Leave nothing in your office that belongs to this organization. We'll discuss the terms of your exit once I've confirmed the transfer is complete." He paused. "And Stefano, if I find a single page missing, the conversation we have will not be a legal one." Stefano said, "Understood," again, in a voice that had gone considerably smaller than the last time he'd used that word. Cassian showered, changed, ate something his housekeeper had left on a tray outside the office door. He ate standing up at the window, looking at the estate in the morning light, and tried to approach what he was facing with the same analytical distance he'd applied to every other operational problem in his career. The summit was in 7 days. Isabella would be there. The other families had already begun recalibrating their assessments of the Moretti position. Dante Ricci had been moving in the margins. The financial infrastructure of the syndicate was architecturally dependent on a woman who had just filed for divorce and driven away in a car he couldn't own. Those were the facts. Facts were workable. Facts could be met with strategy even when the strategy was painful. What he needed before the summit was a clear legal assessment of his actual position regarding the corporate structures. Not Carvelli's compromised reading, but an honest accounting from someone who had no conflicting interest. He needed to know exactly what he could and couldn't touch. He needed to know what Isabella's legal position gave her in terms of operational authority, and whether any of the structures could be challenged on the basis of how they'd been constructed. He needed, in short, to understand the size of the whole before he could work out whether it was survivable. At 11:40, 5 men sat in the main conference room of the estate: Enzo, Luca, Fredo Mancini, Angelo Sette, and Marco Vitali. Cassian stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He had found over the years that there were meetings where sitting communicated the wrong thing, and this was one of them. He told them everything. He did not soften it. He went through the corporate structure findings, the offshore trust situation, the Porto Levante lease, the security contract, the Brightman Bank complication. He told them about Carvelli. He told them about the summit and Isabella's confirmed attendance. He told them about the notebook and what it documented regarding the family relationships. He did not tell them about the notation concerning Dante Ricci. Not yet. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The 5 men were each absorbing it in their own way. Luca with his eyes on the table, processing. Fredo with a stillness that looked like controlled anger. Angelo staring at the far wall. Marco with his hands flat on the table as if he needed the surface for balance. Enzo was watching Cassian. "What are we actually able to move without her authorization?" Fredo said. His voice was clipped, tighter than usual. "Operationally, most things," Cassian said. "The day-to-day is functioning. Cash flow is normal. The men are at their posts, the shipments are moving, the client relationships are intact. What I can't move without complications are the reserve accounts and the facility at Porto Levante. And the security contract, technically, though Drago has confirmed his personal loyalty, and I'm not concerned about the men. But if she chose to exercise the authority," Marco said, "then we'd have a disruption," Cassian said. "She has told me she has no intention of dismantling what she built. I believe that, not because I trust her at this moment, but because it would cost her as much as it would cost us. She's not interested in destruction. She's interested in departure." "The distinction being," Enzo said quietly, "that departure on her terms still requires us to function in a structure she controls." "Yes." "Which means the summit is not just a presentation problem," Enzo continued. "It's an existential one. Because if the families understand what we've just described in this room, they'll understand that the Moretti position is negotiable in a way it hasn't been before," Cassian finished, "which is exactly what Dante Ricci has been waiting for." The room was quiet again. "What do you need from us?" Angelo said. "Loyalty and silence, in that order," Cassian said. "Nothing that was discussed in this room leaves it. Not to your wives, not to your associates, not to anyone connected to any of the other families. If anyone reaches out asking questions about our internal structure, and they will, you know nothing. You've heard nothing. Everything is normal. He looked around the table. Can each of you tell me that without a pause? Each of them said yes, some faster than others. He noted the speed of each answer without changing his expression. After they left, Enzo stayed. He waited until the others were gone, and then he leaned back in his chair and looked at Cassian with the look of a man who had been holding something back for the duration of a difficult meeting and was now deciding whether to release it. The earrings, Enzo said. Tell me. Piero Santi, the former driver whose keycard accessed the gate. I found him. Enzo paused. He's been working for the last 6 weeks for a private hospitality and events company. The company is called Ricci Leisure Holdings. It's registered in Monaco. Another pause. It's Dante's. Cassian sat down for the first time all day. He sat down and put his hands on the table and looked at them and thought about a deactivated keycard that hadn't been deactivated because the system that should have killed it ran under a contract that answered to Isabella's authority. And he thought about Dante Ricci's people asking Valentina to confirm financial intelligence the morning after Isabella walked out. And he thought about the text message, happy to talk if you need a friend. And he thought about the notation in the notebook, 2 years old. RD, approached. Offer declined, file kept. He knows. Dante put Valentina in the house, Cassian said. I believe so. I can't prove it yet. But Santi working for Ricci Leisure and Santi's card opening the gate on that specific night, it's not coincidence. No. Cassian sat with his hands on the table and breathed. He thought it through. Dante had known from wherever he'd gotten the information, from whatever source inside the syndicate had been feeding him, that Isabella's patience with the marriage had an end date. He had positioned himself to accelerate that date, to choose the moment, to ensure that the destabilization of the Moretti position happened close enough to the summit that Cassian would arrive at the table weakened and without time to recover. Valentina had been the instrument. A woman Dante had identified as a vulnerability, had cultivated as a contact, had arranged to be placed inside the Moretti estate on an evening when the damage would be maximum. Whether Dante had known about the earrings specifically, whether that detail was deliberate engineering or an accident of Valentina's vanity or ignorance, Cassian couldn't determine, but the architecture of the thing was clear enough. He used her to trigger Isabella's exit, Cassian said, and then he used Isabella's exit to signal the families that the Moretti position was in question, and now he plans to walk into the summit and present himself as the stable option. That would be my reading, Enzo said. How long has he had someone inside our circle feeding him? I don't know. It could be Santi alone. It could be more. Cassian looked at Enzo. Could it be Carvelli? Enzo held his gaze. I think that's a question worth asking. He asked it 2 hours later, in person, in Carvelli's office in the city. He went alone, which was its own message. Stefano Carvelli was 60 years old, silver-haired, the kind of attorney whose office was full of the right books, and the right light, and the right subtle signals of professional permanence. He had been in that office for 20 years and had the manner of a man who had always expected to die in it. He did not look like that man today. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a knock on the door since early morning and had been getting smaller with each hour of waiting. Cassian sat across from him without being invited to and said, Dante Ricci. Carvelli's face did several things in quick succession, none of them useful to him. How long? Cassian said. Carvelli stopped. He looked at his hands. It wasn't... He stopped again. I'm not here to negotiate with you, Stefano. I'm here to understand the scope. How long, and what did you give him? The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a man deciding he has fewer options than he thought. Carvelli looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had been living with something uncomfortable for long enough that the discomfort had become its own kind of exhaustion. 3 years, he said, roughly. The number hit Cassian like a physical thing. 3 years. He held it and said nothing and let Carvelli fill the silence. He approached me through an intermediary, Carvelli said. He knew about... There were some personal matters, financial matters. Nothing criminal, but the kind of thing that... He had leverage. In the beginning, I gave him very little. Procedural things. Document timing. Nothing strategic. He paused. Over time, the request became more specific. What did he know about Isabella's position? Carvelli closed his eyes for a moment. I didn't know the full extent of her role myself, but certain documents passed through my office. I described earlier that I signed authorizations I hadn't examined fully. Over time, Dante's questions began to focus on those, on the corporate structures, on who the beneficial owners were. He opened his eyes. I told him what I knew, which was incomplete, but enough. Enough to know the structures existed. Yes. Enough to know Isabella's name was on them. Eventually, yes. Cassian sat very still. 3 years. Dante had known for 3 years that the Moretti financial architecture had a seam in it. He had spent 3 years confirming the details through a compromised attorney, building his understanding of the vulnerability, waiting for the right moment to apply pressure. And then he had arranged the scene in the master suite, triggered Isabella's departure, and arrived at the week of the summit with the Moretti Don sitting across from a crisis he'd had 3 years to design. The personal matters he had leverage on, Cassian said. What were they? Carvelli told him. It took 5 minutes. Cassian listened without expression, and when it was done he sat with it for a moment and then said, That's being resolved today, through my resources. You no longer have exposure on that front. He paused. You also no longer have a client. My people will be at your office at 5 to collect the files. Carvelli looked at him. Something moved across the attorney's face. Not quite relief, not quite its opposite. The expression of a man who has been released from one kind of terrible into another kind of uncertain. Cassian, don't. He stood. Don't speak to me again today. He drove back to the estate himself, which he almost never did. He needed the silence, and he needed his hands on something mechanical and responsive. The city moved past the windows. He drove carefully, within every limit and thought. By the time he reached the gate, he had the outline of a response strategy that he spent the following 4 days building with Enzo and Luca and 3 attorneys brought in from outside the syndicate's usual legal circle. It was painstaking, frustrating work, the kind that required sitting for hours with documents that refused to resolve cleanly, tracing corporate registrations through jurisdictions that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of examination. There were moments when the structure seemed to shift as they looked at it, when a legal position Luca had assessed as tenable turned out, on closer reading, to be dependent on an authorization that traced back to an entity Isabella controlled. On the 4th day, one of the new attorneys, a woman named Petra Haas, who had been recommended through a contact in Zurich, and who had the effect of someone who had been delivering bad news to powerful men for long enough that she'd stopped flinching while doing it, sat across the table from Cassian and told him plainly that his legal ability to contest the corporate structure within a time frame relevant to the summit was essentially 0. The structures were built correctly, she said, legally, meticulously, correctly. Contesting beneficial ownership on grounds of improper construction would require demonstrating that the original authorizations were obtained through fraud or duress, and based on what you've described, the authorizations were signed by your designated representatives with your implicit, if not explicit, approval. A court would look at this and see legitimate corporate architecture. She paused. There is no fast solution here. What's the slow solution? Negotiation. With her. Petra held his gaze. The only path that doesn't involve years of litigation is a structured transition agreed upon between the parties, which requires her cooperation, which requires you to reframe the conversation you're having with her. Cassian looked at the table. She's attending the summit in 3 days. I know. If she makes the case she's capable of making in that room, in front of those families, the negotiation happens on her terms in a context where I've already been publicly diminished. Yes, Petra said it without apology. That is the situation. She left. Cassian sat in the conference room alone for a while. On the 6th day, the day before the summit, Enzo came to him with the final piece of the Dante Ricci picture. He laid it on the desk without preamble. A document obtained through a contact in Monaco, a financial registration showing that Ricci Leisure Holdings had been incorporated not 3 years ago, but 6. 6 years ago. 1 year after Cassian and Isabella's wedding. He's been building toward this for 6 years, Enzo said. Cassian looked at the document. He thought about Ronaldo's call. Come see me before the others. He had done that. Had driven to Ronaldo's house 2 days after the call, had sat with the old man for an hour, and Ronaldo had told him things with the patience of someone explaining a diagnosis to a patient who was still in the early stages of understanding their own condition. The families were not going to wait. The summit was a moment of assessment. If Cassian arrived without a coherent account of his position, Dante would fill the vacuum, and the vacuum would become the new reality. Is she contactable? Cassian said. Chiara Russo's number. He called it. Chiara answered and said she would pass the message to Isabella. 20 minutes later, Isabella called back from the same unrecognized number as before. I need to meet, he said. A pause. Why? Because I know what Dante did, and I think you know too, and I think we both need to walk into that room tomorrow with a clearer understanding of what we're actually dealing with. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought she might refuse. There's a restaurant called Galatea, she said finally, on the Lungolago. Be there at 8. He was there at 7:45. He sat at a corner table and watched the door and thought about what he was going to say and discarded most of it. The prepared version felt wrong, too strategic, too much like negotiating, which was how he approached everything and which she had, over 11 years, learned to read before he opened his mouth. She came in at 8 exactly. She was wearing a dark coat, her hair back, no jewelry except the garnet ring on her right hand. Her mother's ring, not the wedding ring, which was still on his desk at the estate. She moved through the room the way she always had, without looking for attention, and sat across from him and looked at him with the same level composure he'd seen in the study on the night everything ended. A waiter came. They both ordered water. The waiter left. You know about Santi, Cassian said. I suspected, she said, when I saw the access log. I know Piero worked for Dante after he left our household. You knew Dante had approached you 2 years ago? Something shifted in her eyes. A small thing. You read the notebook? Yes. She looked at him. Then you know I turned him down. I know what the notation said. I know you kept a file. I know you noted that he was aware of the terms. He wanted me to give him the structures, she said. Full ownership transfer. In exchange for... It doesn't matter. I said no. I kept the record in case he decided to push. She paused. I didn't anticipate that he'd take 6 years to find a different approach. He used Valentina to force your hand. Her face was still. He used Valentina to create a scene he calculated I wouldn't tolerate. He wasn't wrong about that. She picked up her water glass and set it down without drinking. But I want to be clear about something, Cassian. I did not leave because of Valentina. I left because I had been deciding to leave for 2 years. And the evening provided the moment. Dante accelerated my timeline. He did not create it. The words sat on the table between them. He had known this in some way since the study, since the signed papers and the ring already off her finger and the car already at the gate. But hearing her say it removed the last version of the story where his infidelity was the cause and everything else was consequence. The summit tomorrow, he said. I'm attending. I know. I need to understand what you intend to do there. She looked at him for a moment. I intend to present the accurate picture of the Moretti financial infrastructure to the assembled families. Not to damage you. To establish the factual record before Dante establishes a version that serves his interests. And your interests. My interests are served by the truth, she said. My interests are served by the family's understanding exactly who built what and exactly what the transition entails. Because if Dante controls the narrative in that room, what he'll describe is a Moretti empire in free fall that requires a stabilizing partner, which means him, which means a hostile absorption that dismantles everything I spent 11 years constructing. Cassian looked at her. You're not going there to take the empire. I never wanted the empire, she said quietly. I wanted... She stopped. She looked at the window, at the dark water of the lake outside. I wanted to build something that lasted. I built it inside yours because that was the context I was in. I'm not interested in running a criminal organization. I'm interested in extracting my legitimate assets cleanly and establishing them independently. She paused. The summit is about making sure Dante doesn't prevent that. And me. She looked back at him. You'll keep the name and the operational structure. What you'll need to rebuild is the financial architecture, which takes time but isn't impossible. You're 53 years old. You have capable men. You have the Moretti reputation, which is still worth something even after this. She paused. What you won't have is a safety net. I never knew I had one. No, she said. You didn't. They were quiet for a moment. The restaurant was low and warm around them. Other tables occupied, other conversations running. The ordinary noise of ordinary life that had nothing to do with what was happening at this corner table. Dante will come after you in that room, Cassian said. If you're presenting evidence that destabilizes his move on the Moretti position, he'll come after your credibility, your standing, whatever he has. I know. The file you kept, the notation about the approach, do you still have it? I have considerably more than a notation, she said. And for the first time since she'd walked through the door, something appeared in her face that wasn't composure. Something harder, more specific. The look of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was approaching the end of the requirement. She reached into her coat and produced a folded document. She laid it on the table between them. He looked at it. It was a financial record. Transfers, dates, account numbers, running across 3 pages in the format of a bank document. He read the top line. He read the second line. He read far enough to understand what he was looking at. A record of payments made from a Monaco account registered to Ricci Leisure Holdings to an account he recognized as belonging to Stefano Carvelli, running across 37 months. 3 years. Almost exactly. You knew about Carvelli, he said. I suspected. I confirmed it 4 months ago. The breath he took was slow and deliberate. 4 months ago. She had known 4 months ago that his attorney had been feeding intelligence to Dante Ricci. She had held it. She had not told him. He thought about it. She had used the time to finish the corporate architecture, to finalize the divorce papers, to arrange every element of her departure so that when she left from a position of complete information. While he had been operating on his best understanding of the situation, she had been operating on the full picture. Why didn't you tell me? He said. She held his eyes. Because it wasn't my role to manage your intelligence failures, Cassian. I've been managing them for 11 years. That ended when I signed those papers. He sat with that. He sat with it the way you sit with something that is simultaneously an indictment and a fact, that cannot be argued with because it is both true and fair and still costs something to hear. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. What do you need from me in that room? She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not warmth exactly, not anything that simple, but a recognition of some kind. The look of a person acknowledging the distance between what something could have been and what it was. Don't speak first, she said. Whatever Dante opens with, don't respond to it directly. Let him show the room what he came to do. Let them see it before you say anything. She paused. And when I present the documentation, don't react. Whatever you feel when the room understands what I'm showing them. Hold it. The families will be watching your face more than they're watching the documents. She stood. She picked up the financial record and folded it back into her coat. Isabella. He said her name without knowing exactly what he meant to follow it with. She paused. She stood with her coat closed and her hands at her sides and looked at him with the particular kind of patience she'd always had. Not soft patience, not the patience of someone waiting to be thanked, but the patience of someone who had already closed the accounting and was simply extending one last courtesy to a man she'd known for more than a decade. Don't, she said quietly. The same word she'd used on the phone, in the same tone. Whatever you're about to ask me, the answer is that some things don't have a moment where they turn around. You look for the moment, but it's never a single moment. It's a long accumulation of mornings where you chose something else. She held his gaze. I'll see you in the room tomorrow. She walked out. He sat at the corner table and watched her go and did not move for several minutes. The water glass in front of him was still full. The restaurant moved around him. Plates, voices, the ordinary warm noise of people who were not him, who did not have tomorrow on their calendar, who were not about to walk into a room where the entire architecture of their life was going to be examined by 7 men who had been waiting years for the examination. He paid the bill. He drove back to the estate in the dark. In the morning, he dressed with the care of a man who understood that presentation was its own form of communication. Dark suit, no ornamentation, nothing that read as compensating for anything. He ate breakfast. He reviewed one last time the documentation Luca had prepared for the summit. The drive to the summit location took 40 minutes. The venue was a private estate outside the city, neutral ground, the kind of place the families had used for decades because its walls were understood to be the one location where the rules of engagement were suspended in favor of the rules of conversation. He arrived to find the courtyard already occupied. 7 cars, various levels of discretion, his own men at the perimeter, the other family's security reading the space with professional eyes. He walked through the main entrance and into the long room where the table was set. 7 chairs arranged in a configuration that expressed parity, that said, no head, no foot, every man equal, which was the formal fiction the summit always maintained. 6 of the 7 dons were already seated. The 7th chair was empty. Across the room, near the windows, Dante Ricci stood with 2 of his men, holding a glass of water and watching Cassian walk in with the expression of a man who had already written the ending of something and was waiting for the other people in the room to catch up. Their eyes met. Dante smiled. It was the smile of someone who had spent 6 years building toward a specific morning and was now standing inside it. Cassian crossed the room and took his seat. He did not look at Dante again. He sat straight, both hands on the table, and looked at the door. The room was quiet in the way of rooms full of dangerous men who are each waiting to assess what the next few minutes are going to reveal. And then the door opened, and Isabella Vale walked in, and every don at the table rose from his seat. Not together, not choreographed, one by one, in the way that things happen when they are unrehearsed, when the response is automatic rather than calculated. Ronaldo first, then the others, each man reading the room and the room telling them something their bodies answered before their minds had finished the question. Dante Ricci did not rise. He stood near the window with his water glass and watched and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the room had just told him something he had not accounted for in 6 years of planning. Isabella walked to the center of the room without hesitation. She wore charcoal, nothing ornamental, the garnet ring on her right hand catching the light once as she set a leather portfolio on the table. She looked at each face in turn, unhurried, and when her eyes passed over Cassian, he held his expression exactly where she had told him to hold it. She looked at Dante last. She held it 1 beat longer than the others. Then she opened the portfolio. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'll be brief, because what I have to show you is straightforward, and because your time is worth more than elaboration." She laid documents on the table, copies, 1 set for each don, distributed with the efficiency of someone who had prepared this moment with the same precision she applied to everything. Cassian watched the faces around the table as they read. He watched Ronaldo's eyes move across the first page and stop. He watched Fausto, the eldest, turn to the second page with the careful deliberateness of a man who wanted to be certain he was reading what he thought he was reading. The documents showed everything: the corporate structures, the beneficial ownership, the 11 years of financial architecture, and behind those, the payment records. Ricci Leisure Holdings to Carvelli's account, 37 months of it, clean and dated and indisputable. "The Moretti Syndicate's infrastructure is intact and operational," Isabella said. "The transition of my personal holdings will be conducted in an orderly manner over the coming months. Any family considering a move against the Moretti position during that transition period should understand that the documentation before you is held in escrow with 3 separate legal institutions, with instructions to release to relevant authorities should anything irregular occur." She paused. "I'm not interested in war. I'm interested in a clean exit. These are the terms under which that happens." She closed the portfolio. She looked at Dante Ricci. Dante set down his water glass. The smile was gone. In its place was the face of a man watching 6 years of architecture come apart in the span of 8 minutes, watching the room look at him with the payment records in their hands and understanding exactly what they were reading. "The Ricci proposal for partnership," Ronaldo said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man making a notation, appears to have a prior context the assembly was not made aware of. Dante said nothing. There was nothing to say. Isabella picked up her portfolio. She looked at Cassian one final time across the table, not with softness, not with triumph, with something that had no clean name, the look of a woman who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had just, in front of 7 witnesses, set it down. Then she walked out of the room. The door closed behind her. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and inside those 10 seconds, the entire balance of power in the room shifted permanently, settled into a new configuration, and locked. Cassian sat with both hands on the table and breathed and did not speak first, exactly as she had told him to. The 10 seconds ended when Ronaldo spoke again. "I think," the old man said, in the particular tone he used when he was not thinking aloud but delivering a verdict that had already been reached, "that we should proceed with the assembled business in a somewhat different order than originally planned." He set the payment documents on the table in front of him, squaring the edges with 2 fingers, a precise and deliberate gesture. "The Ricci proposal for Northern Partnership will be tabled, indefinitely." He looked around the table. "Are there objections?" There were no objections. Dante Ricci pushed off from the window. His 2 men moved with him, the reflexive repositioning of security that reads a room changing. Cassian watched it without turning his head fully. Peripheral tracking, the kind of spatial awareness that 22 years in rooms like this had made automatic. Dante was moving toward the door. Not fleeing, Dante would never permit himself the optics of flight, but withdrawing, which was its own kind of answer to a question the room had just asked. He stopped near Cassian's chair. Cassian didn't look up. "This isn't finished," Dante said. His voice was low, controlled, stripped of the performance it had carried all morning. What was underneath was harder and less polished and considerably more honest. Cassian looked up at him then. He took his time doing it. He met Dante's eyes and held them and said nothing at all, which, in the context of this room, in front of these men, communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Dante held it for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. The door closed. Fausto, the eldest Don, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhalation of a man who had seen many rooms and recognized this one for what it was. "Well," he said, to no one specifically, "that was instructive." The summit continued for another 2 hours. Cassian presented the expansion proposal, a shortened version, stripped of the elements that depended on the financial infrastructure he couldn't currently leverage, rebuilt around the operational strengths that were genuinely his. It was a weaker proposal than the one he'd prepared 3 weeks ago. Every man at the table knew it. Nobody said so. What they gave him instead was something more valuable than approval of an ambitious proposal. They gave him the signal, conveyed through the particular attentiveness of men who had just watched a rival expose himself as a fraud, that the Moretti position remained legitimate, diminished, complicated, requiring reconstruction. But legitimate. It was enough. For today, it was enough. He drove back to the estate alone, Marco in the front seat, the privacy screen up. He sat in the back and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained expenditure of control. The hours of holding his face exactly right, of measuring every word, of sitting in a room where the wrong gesture could have cost him more than the right gesture could gain. His shoulders ached. His jaw was tight in a way that told him he'd been clenching it for hours without noticing. He thought about what came next. Dante was next. That was not negotiable. Whatever legal and strategic distance the summit had created between them, Dante Ricci had spent 6 years engineering the destruction of the Moretti position, had compromised Cassian's attorney, had placed a woman inside his home like a piece on a board, had timed the collapse of his marriage with the precision of a man who had been patient enough to wait for the exact right moment. That was not the kind of thing that resolved through institutional channels. That was the kind of thing that required a different conversation. But first there was the matter of his own house. Enzo was waiting at the estate when Cassian arrived. He was standing in the north entrance corridor with his jacket still on, which meant he'd been waiting for a while and had not permitted himself the comfort of settling in. He read Cassian's face as he came through the door, the practiced assessment of a man who had been reading that face for 2 decades, and said, "How bad?" "Dante's proposal is dead. His position with the families is compromised." Cassian handed his coat to Benedetto and kept walking toward the north office. He won't accept it quietly. Enzo fell into step beside him. He has people inside our circle, beyond Carvelli, beyond Santi. I know. We need to find them before he uses them. I know, Enzo. He pushed the office door open and went to the desk and stood behind it without sitting, the way he'd been doing all day. The standing a refusal to settle, a refusal to let his body believe the day was done. Who do we know for certain? Carvelli, Santi. A junior financial analyst in Luca's department named Betty. Luca flagged him this morning, found irregular data access going back 8 months. Luca has him isolated. Enzo paused. And there may be someone in communications, someone with access to scheduling. Cassian looked at him. Scheduling. The summit venue change. The original location was moved at Isabella's request, but the new location was communicated through our internal scheduling system 26 hours before the summit. If Dante had access to scheduling, he knew about the venue before most of our own people did. He had time to prepare for whatever he brought into that room. Cassian pulled out the chair and sat down after all. He was too tired to maintain the posture. Get me the access log for the scheduling system. Every person who touched that communication. I want it tonight. Already pulling it. Enzo sat across from him. There's something else. The way he said it, the particular weight he put on those 2 words, the slight forward movement in his shoulders, told Cassian the something else was the thing Enzo had actually been waiting at the door to say. Tell me. Valentina? Enzo said. She called me this morning. Before the summit, she was not calm. She said Dante's people had contacted her again last night. She said they told her that the situation at the summit was going to resolve in Dante's favor, and that when it did, her position would be, she used the word protected. He paused. She was calling me because she was scared, I think. She didn't say that directly, but it was in the call. She said she had information she hadn't given anyone yet, about what Dante's people asked her to do before the night she came to the estate. Cassian was very still. What did they ask her to do? She wouldn't say it on the phone. She asked to meet. Where is she? An apartment in the 3rd district. Not the one you know about, a different one. She said Dante's people set her up there 2 weeks ago. She didn't understand why until last night. Cassian looked at Enzo. He was moving her to a location he controlled. That's my reading. When did she contact you? 7 this morning. It's now... He looked at his watch. 4:15. That's 9 hours she's been in an apartment Dante's people own. Enzo said nothing. He didn't need to. Cassian stood. He felt the exhaustion in his body shift and reconfigure into something else. Not energy exactly, but the thing that replaces energy when energy is gone. The blunt, forceful mechanism that takes over when a man has been running on control for too long and the situation stops permitting control as the primary tool. Get me the address, he said. Get Marco, get Drago and 2 of his men, nobody else. Cassian. She's a 29-year-old woman in an apartment owned by a man who just watched his 6-year plan collapse in a summit room, Cassian said. Whatever she is or isn't, she's not leaving her there. They were moving in 11 minutes. 2 cars, Marco driving the first, Drago in the second with his men. The city was in its late afternoon state, the traffic dense and ordinary, the kind of city movement that was indifferent to everything happening inside the cars threading through it. Cassian sat in the back and watched the streets and thought about Dante. The summit had cost Dante his proposal and his credibility with the families. Those were significant losses, significant enough that a rational man would absorb them and recalibrate and find another angle. But Dante was not, Cassian had come to understand, primarily rational. He was primarily driven, which was different. Rational men accepted the costs of failed strategies and moved on. Driven men looked for something to hit. Valentina was something to hit. The apartment building was in a residential block. Unremarkable. The kind of building that existed in numbers across the city, 10 stories of ordinary lives stacked on top of each other. Drago's men went in first, cleared the lobby, confirmed the stairwell. Cassian and Marco took the stairs. 3rd floor, apartment 12. Drago knocked. Standard knock. nothing aggressive. 30 seconds of silence. He knocked again. The door opened on a chain. One eye visible in the gap, then recognition, and the chain coming off fast. The door pulling wide. Valentina looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back roughly, no makeup, wearing clothes that looked like she'd put them on in the dark and hadn't changed them. She looked at Cassian with an expression that moved through several things quickly. Relief, fear, the specific complicated shame of someone who has understood belatedly that they were used and is standing inside that understanding for the first time without a way to manage how it looks. "You came," she said. "Get your things," Cassian said. She moved fast. She had a bag already half-packed, he noticed, which told him she had been thinking about leaving since before he'd arrived. She moved through the apartment collecting things with the jerky efficiency of someone whose adrenaline had been running too long, and he stood in the doorway and watched the room, sparse, recently occupied, the kind of furnished neutrality that said this space had been prepared for someone rather than lived in by them. A phone on the kitchen counter, not hers, the wrong model, no case, the generic blank face of a device that had been placed and not chosen. He crossed to it and picked it up. The screen showed 3 unread messages from a contact listed only as a number. He opened the first one. It was from that morning. It read, "Stay inside, summit going as planned. You'll hear from us by noon." The second, from early afternoon, "Change of plans, stay where you are." The third, from 40 minutes ago, while Cassian was still in the car driving back from the summit, read, "We need you to make a call. We'll explain when we arrive." He put the phone in his jacket pocket. "Valentina." His voice came out harder than he intended. She stopped moving and looked at him. "What did they ask you to do before the night you came to the estate?" She held the bag against her chest. Her knuckles were pale. "They told me, Dante's man, the one who contacted me initially, he said he had a business arrangement with you, that bringing me to the estate that evening was part of finalizing the arrangement. He said you'd approved it." She swallowed. "He gave me the key card. He said it was a gift. From you." "He told you I sent the key card?" "Yes." Her voice was very small. "And the earrings." She closed her eyes briefly. "He said they were a welcome gift. From the household. That Isabella kept jewelry in the dressing room and I was welcome to..." He said it specifically. He described the box. He said the combination was her birthday. Cassian stood with the information and let it settle completely into place. Dante's man had given Valentina the key card, the combination, the specific location of the box, the specific piece to take from it. She hadn't found the earrings. She'd been handed them like a prop and told what they were for, and she hadn't understood, probably still didn't fully understand, that she'd been costumed and positioned and walked onto a stage whose purpose was entirely different from anything she'd been told. He was not going to tell her this now. There was no version of that conversation that served any current purpose. "Come on," he said. They came out of the building into the late afternoon gray, Drago's men bracketing the exit, Marco already with the car door open. Cassian put Valentina in the second car with Drago and got into the first with Marco, and they moved. 4 blocks from the apartment building, a black SUV pulled out of a side street and fell in behind them. Marco saw it in the mirror and said, "Company?" in the flat voice of a man who'd had this conversation before. Cassian looked in the mirror. The SUV was running 2 cars back, too consistent to be coincidence. Plates. Rotating, they switched twice in the last 3 blocks. Drago's voice came through the earpiece. "Second vehicle to our right. Blue sedan, same speed pattern. 2 vehicles. Professional spacing. Not police. Police had different patterns, different distances. Dante's people, then, which meant the message on the apartment phone, 'We'll explain when we arrive,' had been sent to Valentina while someone was already watching the building and had seen Cassian arrive. "Options," Cassian said. Marco was already thinking. "The Calvino garage, 4 blocks. We can lose the sedan in the structure. The SUV won't be able to follow both cars if we split on level 2. "Do it." Marco moved. The car accelerated cleanly into a lane change, then another, threading the traffic with the practiced precision of 9 years of driving for a man who frequently needed to be somewhere quickly or not be somewhere at all. Cassian held the handle above the door and watched the mirror and thought. Dante had people outside the apartment building, which meant Dante had been monitoring Valentina since at least this afternoon, which meant the third message on the phone, "We need you to make a call," was the thing he needed to understand, because the call Dante wanted Valentina to make was not a call to Cassian. If it had been a call to Cassian, it would have already been made. It was a call to someone else. He thought about who Valentina could call that Dante would find useful. He thought about it for about 4 seconds before it arrived. Isabella. Valentina was one of the few people who had a number for Isabella's personal line. She'd called it once, months ago, in a moment of whatever it had been, a confrontation that Isabella had shut down in under a minute and that Cassian had heard about secondhand. But the number existed in Valentina's phone. And if Dante wanted to reach Isabella in the hours after the summit, if he wanted to make contact in a way that couldn't be traced back to him, if he wanted to use the voice of the woman who'd been in the master suite to deliver a message or a threat or something else entirely. "Marco," he said. "Change of destination. I need to reach Isabella Vale before Dante's people do." Marco didn't ask questions. He changed direction. Cassian pulled out his phone. He dialed Chiara Russo's number. It rang 3 times and went to voicemail. He dialed again. Voicemail. He typed a message. "Urgent. Call me immediately. Do not let Isabella be alone." He tried the number Isabella had used to call him. It rang and did not pick up. The city moved past the windows fast now, Marco driving with purpose through the gaps in traffic. The kind of driving that was below the threshold of visible emergency, but well above ordinary. Cassian sat with the phone in his hand and his jaw tight and thought about where Isabella would be after the summit. She would have left the venue and gone. Where? Not the estate, not anywhere connected to the syndicate's infrastructure. Somewhere he didn't know, which was the whole point of the last 2 weeks, and which was now a vulnerability rather than a clean break. "Enzo," he said into the earpiece. "Here. I need Isabella's current location. Whatever you can find, whoever you need to call, I need it in the next 10 minutes. A pause. "That's 10 minutes, Enzo." The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll try Ronaldo. He may have a contact number for her. She spoke to him before the summit. He may have kept a line open." "Do it now!" Drago's voice cut in. "We've lost the sedan. The SUV is still with us further back. They're not closing." "They're tracking, not intercepting," Cassian said. "They want to see where we go." "Should I lose them?" He thought about it for 2 seconds. "No, let them follow. If they're watching us, they're not watching her." He paused. "But get me a route that adds 15 minutes to wherever we end up going. Give me time for Enzo to find the location." "Copy." The car moved through the city in the fading light. Cassian sat with the phone and the tightness in his chest that he was not going to name, and the specific focused dread of a man who has spent all day managing one crisis only to watch a second one take shape in the time it took to drive 4 blocks. He thought about the third message on the apartment phone. The timing of it. 40 minutes after the summit ended, 40 minutes after Dante's proposal had been publicly destroyed, 40 minutes after Dante had walked out of a room in front of 6 witnesses with his credibility in pieces. 40 minutes was long enough for a man to absorb a catastrophic loss. It was not long enough for a rational man to formulate a response. But Dante, as Cassian had established, was not primarily rational. 40 minutes was long enough for a driven man to decide that if he couldn't win, he was going to make the cost of his loss as high as possible for everyone who had put him in that room. Enzo's voice in his ear. "Ronaldo has a contact address, not a phone. An address. She's at a private residence on the Colle Meridiano. I'm sending coordinates." The address arrived on his phone. He read it and showed it to Marco, who glanced at it and nodded and began to move. "How far?" Cassian said. 22 minutes in this traffic, Marco said. 17 if we stop being polite about it." "Stop being polite." The car surged. Behind them, at a distance, the SUV kept pace. Cassian watched it in the mirror and thought about Dante somewhere in the city, in a car or an office or a room, having received the report from his people that Cassian was moving with purpose through the streets and calculating, as Dante always calculated, what that meant and what to do about it. The difference between them in this moment was one thing only. Cassian knew where he was going, and he knew why. And he was not going there to negotiate or to threaten or to demonstrate the dominance of the Moretti position or to manage any of the dozens of strategic considerations that had governed every decision he'd made in the last 9 days. He was going because the woman who had built his empire and walked away from it and stood in front of 7 of the most dangerous men in the world and told the truth and then walked out of the room without looking back was somewhere in this city. And Dante Ricci had 40 minutes and a phone and a plan, and Cassian Moretti was 17 minutes away and had nothing except the absolute certainty that he was not going to be too late. Marco pushed through a yellow light. The city blurred past. The SUV fell back 2 blocks, then 3, then lost them at a split. 16 minutes. Enzo came back on the line, his voice carrying a texture Cassian hadn't heard from him before. Not alarm. Enzo didn't alarm, but something close to it, the compressed urgency of a man passing information he wishes he didn't have. Cassian, he said. Drago's contact in the Ricci security detail just pushed something. Dante left the city 40 minutes ago. Private car, not his usual driver. Destination unknown. A pause. He had 2 men with him. Both of them are... These are not administrative people. These are men Dante uses for a specific category of problem. The word landed in the car like something physical. Cassian said, "Faster, Marco." Marco didn't answer. The car answered instead. The engine note climbing, the city compressing into streaks of light on either side, the gaps in traffic becoming decisions made in fractions of seconds. Cassian gripped the door handle and watched the coordinates on his phone and counted the distance down and felt his heartbeat in his throat, for the first time in longer than he could remember. 14 minutes became 9, became 5. The Colle Meridiano was a residential hillside, old money, private drives behind stone walls, the kind of neighborhood that kept itself quiet by design. Marco turned off the main road without being told and cut the headlights on instinct and took the last 200 meters at a crawl. The private residence was a stone villa behind a low gate. The gate was open. It should not have been open. "Stop here," Cassian said. He was out of the car before it fully stopped. Drago materialized from the second vehicle without a word and fell into position to his left, one of his men to the right, and they moved through the open gate in the particular formation of men who have done this before and understand that speed and quiet are not opposites. The front door of the villa was closed but unlocked. Cassian pushed it open. The entrance hall was lit, empty. Somewhere deeper in the house, a voice, male, low, the controlled tone of a man who believes he has the room, was speaking. Cassian moved toward it. The voice was coming from a sitting room at the end of the corridor. He reached the doorway and took in the room in one sweep. Isabella standing near the far window, very still, the composed stillness he recognized as the version she used when she was managing something dangerous. 2 men he didn't know flanking the room's other entry. And Dante Ricci, standing in the center of the room with his jacket still on from the summit, looking like a man who had arrived here with a specific purpose and was partway through it. Dante heard him and turned. The 2 men moved. Drago's man moved faster, and the room made several decisions simultaneously. And when the noise settled, Drago had 1 man against the wall, and the other was on the floor, and Dante was standing very alone in the center of the room, with nothing between him and Cassian except 4 feet of open space and the specific silence of a situation that had arrived at its final form. Dante looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not fear. Dante was too constructed for visible fear, but the recognition of a man who has run his calculation to its end and found the answer he didn't want. "It's done, Dante," Cassian said. His voice came out quiet and absolute. "All of it. Tonight." Dante looked at Isabella, then back at Cassian. He straightened his jacket. He breathed once through his nose, and he sat down in the nearest chair. Not in surrender, but in the posture of a man who has understood that the room has changed and that the only move left is to negotiate the terms of what comes next from whatever position he still occupies. "Then let's talk," Dante said. Cassian stepped into the room. He did not look at Isabella yet. He would, but not yet, because the man in the chair required his complete attention for what came next. And what came next was going to require every remaining measure of the cold, precise, unforgiving discipline that had kept Cassian Moretti at the head of his empire for 22 years, and was now, finally, being asked to earn that position from the ground up. The room held its shape for a long moment after Dante sat down. Drago's man kept his position near the wall. The second of Dante's people was on his feet again, wrist held at an angle that suggested it wasn't functioning correctly, standing with the careful stillness of someone who had made a rapid assessment of the room and determined that stillness was the only remaining option. The lamp on the side table threw a warm, indifferent light across everything. Across Dante in the chair, across Isabella still near the window, across the space between Cassian and all of it, that he crossed now in 4 steps and occupied with the full weight of a man who had driven 17 minutes at speed and arrived at the end of something that had been building for 11 years. He pulled a chair from near the wall and set it in front of Dante and sat in it, close. The distance of a conversation between two people who have no more use for the performance of distance. Dante looked at him. The construction was still there, the expensive suit, the groomed composure, but underneath it something had gone slack, the way a structure goes slack when the tension holding it in shape is suddenly removed. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had spent 6 years building toward a specific outcome and had arrived instead at a stone villa on a hillside with 2 incapacitated men and no remaining moves. "The Brightman accounts," Cassian said. "You have a secondary contact there, someone who was going to execute a transfer request in the event the summit went your way." Dante said nothing. "The name," Cassian said. "That's not a conversation I'm having tonight." Cassian looked at him without expression. "You came to this house with 2 men and a phone and a plan. The plan involved Isabella making a call she wasn't going to make willingly, which means you were prepared to make it unwilling, which means you walked into this room prepared to do something that would have ended your relationship with every remaining family in the network, not just the ones in that summit room today." He paused. "So I know you're not a careful man anymore. Careful men don't make the move you just made, which means the Brightman contact is either already activated or you've got a timer on it, and either way, I need the name." Dante looked at the floor. Something moved through his jaw. A tightening, a decision being made at the level of bone before it reached his face. Then he looked up and said, "Victor Haas, private client manager, extension 417. Cassian glanced at Enzo, who was in the doorway now. He'd come in quietly during the exchange, the way Enzo always moved in rooms that required his presence but not his announcement. Enzo already had his phone out. He stepped back into the corridor. Dante watched this and said, "It won't matter. The instruction was conditional. It won't execute without a confirmation code." "What's the code?" A pause, longer than the last one. "Dante." Cassian's voice dropped. Not louder. The opposite. The particular register that people who had known him long enough understood as the final threshold before something irreversible. "You put 2 men in a room with my wife. I drove here in 17 minutes. I am speaking to you calmly, and I would like to continue doing that. But I need the code." The word wife landed in the room and registered on Dante's face and registered on Isabella's. He felt that without looking at her, the way you feel a shift in light without turning toward the window. "Meridiano," Dante said, all lowercase. Cassian relayed it to Enzo through the doorway without raising his voice. Enzo repeated it into his phone and walked further down the corridor. The room was quiet. Isabella moved for the first time since Cassian had entered. Not much, a shift of weight, a slight turn away from the window, the body deciding it no longer needed to maintain the particular rigidity of someone holding a room together through sheer composure. She sat in the chair near the window. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and looked at a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. She looked tired. Not the performance of fatigue, not the strategic exhaustion of someone making a point, just tired. The real kind. The kind that accumulates across years and finally shows itself when the last thing requiring concealment has been handled. Cassian looked at Dante. "You're going to give Enzo a full accounting of every asset, contact, and operative you placed inside the Moretti organization over the last 6 years. Every name, every arrangement, every piece of information that was passed and through whom. You're going to do this tonight, completely, and you're going to understand that what happens to you afterward depends entirely on the completeness of what you provide. And if I don't, then what happens to you afterward is determined by a different set of considerations. He held Dante's eyes. You're 62 days from a situation where your own financial records, the ones Isabella has been holding in escrow since 4 months ago, are released to parties who would find them very interesting. You know this because you know she has them. You've known since the summit this morning that she gave copies to the legal institutions she named. He paused. You have no version of the next 6 months that improves by fighting me tonight. You have one version that remains survivable. This is it. Dante sat with his hands on his knees. He was breathing carefully, the measured breath of a man managing something physical, anger, maybe, or the specific somatic impact of watching a plan collapse so completely that even the contingencies are gone. He looked older than he had in the summit room that morning. The hours between had done something to him that the morning hadn't. Fine, he said. The word had no remaining architecture to it. It was just a word. Fine. Enzo came back to the doorway. Haas has been reached. The instruction has been voided. The account is frozen pending a full review. He looked at Cassian. Also, Betty, the analyst in Luca's department, he's confirmed Dante as the contact, and the scheduling access was a woman named Testa in communications. She's been suspended pending. Cassian nodded. He stood. He looked at Dante once more, at the man in the chair who had been the most dangerous problem in his life for the last 9 days, and who now sat with his hands on his knees in a borrowed room, looking like what he actually was. A man who had made a very long bet on a very specific outcome and had lost it completely. Enzo will stay with you, Cassian said. Talk to him the way you talk to me. He turned and walked to the window where Isabella was sitting. She looked up at him. The tiredness was still there, fully visible now. The thing she'd been holding back in every composed room and every measured phone call and every deliberate gesture of the last 2 weeks. She looked like herself, which was different from all the versions of herself she'd been presenting since the night in the master suite. Not the woman closing the accounting of 11 years, not the invisible architect revealing herself to a room of dangerous men, not the person on the other end of a phone call extending courtesies she didn't owe, just Isabella. 41 years old, sitting in a chair in a villa on a hillside after a very long day. Are you hurt? He said. No. She looked at him. They arrived 10 minutes before you. They hadn't done anything yet. A pause. They were waiting for Valentina to call. I know. How did you know to come here? Ronaldo had the address. She absorbed that. He gave it to you. He did. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The adjustment of a woman who had managed the Ronaldo relationship carefully for years and was now processing what it meant that the old man had made a specific choice in a specific direction. He's always been more perceptive than people give him credit for, she said. Most of them are. They were quiet for a moment. Through the window, the hillside fell away into the city lights below, the whole spread of the city in its ordinary nighttime configuration, indifferent and luminous and entirely unaware of what had happened in this room. Valentina, Isabella said. In the car, she's not hurt. She didn't know what she was doing. On the night, she didn't know. It wasn't a question. It was Isabella completing a calculation she'd been running since that night, arriving finally at the answer she'd suspected but hadn't been able to confirm. Dante's man gave her the key card and the combination and the specific piece to take, Cassian said. He told her it was a welcome gift. She didn't know what the earrings were. Isabella looked at the window. Her right hand moved to the garnet ring on her right hand, not twisting it, just touching it, the brief contact of a person reaching for something that stays. That doesn't change what I saw, she said. No. It changes what she is. It doesn't change what I decided. I know that too. She looked at him. The look was direct and honest and had nothing defensive in it, nothing protecting something that still needed protecting. I meant what I said at the restaurant. It wasn't the earrings. It wasn't even Valentina. It was the accumulation of all the mornings I described. I know. Do you? He sat on the edge of the low table near her chair. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked at her. "I read the notebook," he said. "All of it. The family interventions, the Ferrara succession, the conflict resolution with the Gotti operation 3 years ago that I thought resolved itself." He paused. "I spent 2 days reading what you built and understanding that I had been given credit for a peace I didn't make, for a stability I didn't maintain, for relationships I didn't manage." He held her eyes. "And I spent those 2 days trying to construct an argument for why that made strategic sense, why a division of labor between two capable people was a reasonable way to run an operation, and I couldn't get there. Because that's not what it was. It was you doing the work and me not looking, and those are different things." Isabella was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the villa were around them. Enzo's voice in the corridor, low and professional, extracting what he needed from Dante. The city outside. The lamp. "What do you want me to say to that?" she said. "Nothing. I'm not saying it to get something back." He looked at the window. "I'm saying it because in 2 weeks I've had to learn the shape of 11 years all at once, and the shape is considerably different from what I believed it was. And I think you deserve to know that I understand that, not as a negotiation, not as a strategy." He paused. "Just as a fact I'm handing you because it belongs to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The tiredness in her face didn't change, but something beneath it shifted. Not softened, not moved in the direction of anything reversible, but acknowledged. The look of someone receiving something honestly given and receiving it honestly. "The divorce finalizes in 31 days, she said. "I know. I'm not reconsidering it. I'm not asking you to." She nodded. Once, small, the nod of someone closing a specific question. Then she said, "The transition documentation. Chiara has everything prepared. It's structured so that the handoff of the corporate entities happens in 4 tranches over 6 months. Clean, auditable, nothing that creates exposure for either side. Your new attorneys will need to review it, but it's fair. I didn't build it to disadvantage you." "I know you didn't." "The Porto Levante lease. I've instructed the holding entity to negotiate a direct transfer to a Moretti-controlled structure. The terms are at market rate. It's the right thing to do and it stabilizes your northern operation during the transition." She paused. "The Brightman relationship will need rebuilding. Victor Haas is compromised by his contact with Dante. You'll want a different manager. I can give you a name if you want one." "That would be useful." She nodded again. She stood, smoothing her coat, the automatic gesture of someone preparing to move. She was still herself in this, the practicality running beneath everything, the instinct to close the open items before leaving a room. "Isabella." He stood with her. She paused. "The Pagani," he said. Something crossed her face. The first thing that was close to a genuine smile, not performed, not aimed at anything, small and brief and real. "It was reserved through a private collector in Stuttgart. I finalized the acquisition 14 months ago." She held his eyes. "I always liked beautiful things, Cassian. You knew that." "I knew it," he said. "I didn't know you well enough to understand what it meant about you." She held his gaze one last time. The lamp threw its warm light. The city spread below the window. In the corridor, Enzo's voice continued its patient, methodical work, and Dante's voice answered it, diminished and specific and no longer dangerous. "Take care of Drago," she said. "He's loyal to you in a way that's rarer than you know." Then she picked up her portfolio from the table where she'd set it when Dante's men had arrived, and she walked to the door and through it, and Cassian heard her steps in the corridor and heard her exchange a brief, quiet word with Enzo, and then heard the front door of the villa open and close. He stood at the window. Below, after a moment, headlights appeared on the private drive. A car he didn't recognize. Not the Pagani, something lower profile. A practical choice for a practical evening. The headlights moved down the drive and reached the gate and turned onto the road and were absorbed into the grid of the city's lights, and were gone. He stood there for a while. Enzo appeared in the doorway behind him. "Dante's given me 11 names. 3 inside our organization, 2 in the legal structure, 6 external contacts he used across the 6 years. Betty, Testa, and a man in Drago's administrative office named Quaresima." He paused. "Also the contact at Brightman, the name of the Monaco registration agent who built the Ricci leisure structure. and the intermediary who first approached Carvelli. He was quiet for a moment. It's comprehensive. You believe him? I believe he's too tired to lie and smart enough to know that incomplete cooperation is worse than none. Enzo stepped into the room. What do you want to do with him? Cassian turned from the window. He looked at Dante in the chair. The man had not moved, was sitting with a stillness that was no longer constructed but simply depleted. A man at the end of a very long effort. 62 years old, the youngest of the 7 Dons, the one who had been waiting the longest for the window to open. He goes home, Cassian said. Tonight. His proposal is dead, his network inside our organization is burned, and every family at that table today saw the payment records. He doesn't need our intervention. What's already in motion is sufficient. Enzo looked at him. Something in the look was measuring, the assessment of a man who has known Cassian for 20 years and is determining whether the decision in front of him is a strategic one or something else. You're sure, Enzo said. He came here tonight and found a room that was already changed, Cassian said. That's enough. Send him home. Enzo went to handle it. Cassian stayed at the window. The weeks that followed were the hardest work of Cassian Moretti's professional life, and they were hard in a way that gunfire and intimidation and the accumulated violence of 2 decades had not been hard, because the work was architectural and legal and administrative and required him to sit with attorneys and accountants for hours at a time, absorbing information that resisted the tools he'd always used to absorb difficult information. There was no version of rebuilding the financial infrastructure that felt like victory. There was only the slow, unglamorous process of constructing something solid out of the pieces that remained. Pieces that were, once the Dante situation was resolved and the Brightman relationship was rebuilt through a new contact whose name Isabella had provided, genuinely sufficient. The Moretti syndicate was damaged, not destroyed. The distinction mattered. Rinaldo called twice during those weeks. The calls were brief and practical. Information about the other families, about the realignment of positions following the summit, about the particular vacuum that Dante's exposure had created in the Southern Territories, and the question of who would eventually fill it. The calls were also, Cassian understood, a form of the old man's version of support, which expressed itself through useful intelligence rather than sentiment. On the 31st day, the divorce finalized. Carvelli's former associate filed the papers, confirmed receipt, sent Cassian a notification that was 3 sentences long and entirely procedural. Cassian read it at his desk in the North office and set his phone face down and sat with it for a while. He thought about the notebook, which was still in the desk drawer. He thought about the ring, which he'd moved from the leather pad to the drawer as well, at some point during the 2nd week, because the leather pad needed to be a working surface again, and the ring on it was not a working element. He thought about what Petra Haas had said, the attorney from Zurich, the one who had delivered the bad news about the legal structure without flinching. She had said the only fast path was negotiation with Isabella. What she hadn't said, because it wasn't her role to say it, was that the negotiation Isabella had conducted had been scrupulously fair. The transition documentation was exactly what she'd described it as. Clean, auditable, nothing designed to disadvantage him. The Porto Levante transfer had finalized 2 weeks prior at market rate. The new Brightman contact was legitimate and competent. She had done what she'd said she would do. He'd had Chiara Russo's number since the summit. He had not used it. On the 32nd day, he used it. He asked Chiara to pass a message, not to Isabella directly, because that wasn't his right anymore, and he understood it, but to let her know that the Porto Levante transfer had completed without complications, and that the organization was stable. Chiara said she would pass it along. 3 days later, a message arrived through Chiara, brief, professional, in the same tone as all the documentation that had passed between them in the previous month. It said that she was glad to hear it, and that the last tranche of the corporate transition would execute on schedule, and that she hoped he'd found a capable head of legal to replace Carvelli's office. He had. A woman named Russo, no relation to Chiara, who had come recommended through Petra Haas and who had spent her first 2 weeks in the role finding things in the existing documentation that the previous attorney should have flagged years ago. She was difficult to work with and entirely right about everything she identified, which were the 2 qualities he'd decided to prioritize. He read the message twice. Then he put the phone down and looked at the north window, at the November sky that was the same gray it had been on the first morning of all of this, unvaried and indifferent, the sky that didn't track human timelines. That evening he went for a drive. Not with Marco, alone, which he almost never did, taking one of the estate's unremarkable cars and going out through the gate onto the main road without a destination in any specific sense. He drove through the city and through the streets he knew, and some he didn't, and let the movement do what movement had always done, which was provide the illusion of progress when the actual progress was happening somewhere more interior and less visible. He ended up on the Lungolago. He didn't plan it. The city directed him there the way cities do when you're not resisting. He drove along the water and watched the lights on the far bank and thought about Galatea, the restaurant, the corner table, the water glass she hadn't drunk from, the document with the payment records folded into her coat. He pulled over and stopped the car and sat with the engine running and looked at the water. He thought about what she'd said at the Galatea. Some things don't have a moment where they turn around. It's a long accumulation of mornings where you chose something else. He had been thinking about it since she said it, on and off, the way you think about a thing that is true enough to require sustained attention. He had been trying to locate the mornings she meant, the specific mornings, the specific choices, and he could find some of them. Not all. The ones he couldn't find troubled him more than the ones he could, because the ones he couldn't find were the ones that had happened without his awareness, the ones where the choosing had been so automatic that it hadn't registered as a choice at all. That was the part no amount of organizational rebuilding could address. That was the part that would require a different kind of work, slower and less visible than corporate restructuring, with no Enzo to consult and no Luca to audit the progress, and no external marker to indicate when the thing was done. He sat with it. The water was black and still, and the lights on the far bank were the city being itself, continuous and unconcerned. Somewhere on the other side of that city, Isabella Vale was building something. She had said she would. An independent investment enterprise, legitimate, beyond the reach of the underworld she was extracting herself from, built on the capital she had accumulated through 11 years of invisible work. She would be good at it. She had always been good at building things. The difference now was that what she built would be entirely visible, entirely hers, constructed in full light rather than in the shadows of someone else's empire. He thought about the Pagani, the black car at the gate, the low engine at idle, the gate opening without hesitation in response to her authority. He had spent 2 years being told that car wasn't available, that every example was privately reserved, that it was simply not something he could acquire, and it had been hers. Not claimed from him, never his to claim. Simply hers, chosen and purchased, and waiting for the moment she was ready to use it. He understood now what he hadn't understood that night. The car had not been a statement aimed at him. It hadn't been designed for his observation, arranged to make a point about his limitations. It had been exactly what it appeared to be. A woman who liked beautiful things and had acquired one, and who had left in it because it was there and it was hers, and she was going. The statement, if there was one, was in the going, not in anything she'd chosen to take. He sat another few minutes at the water's edge. Then he put the car in gear and drove back through the city toward the estate, through the gate, up the gravel drive past the fountain that ran its indifferent cycle in the dark. He parked and went inside. The north office was lit. The desk was a working desk again. Documents, a clean legal pad, the new attorney's preliminary assessment of 3 contractual issues that needed his attention in the morning. The leather pad was clear. The drawer was closed. He stood at the window one more time before he sat down. The estate was quiet. The guards were at their posts. The perimeter lights ran their cold wash along the drive. Everything inside the gate was functioning, operational, his, genuinely his, in the way that only things you've rebuilt from a partial ruin are genuinely yours, with full knowledge of their weight and their structure and the specific effort it costs to make them stand. He was 53 years old. He had a damaged empire, a capable staff, 11 names from Dante Ricci's network that Enzo was methodically addressing, a new attorney who was difficult and correct about everything, and a clear understanding of exactly how much of what he'd believed about himself had been built on a foundation he hadn't examined. He sat down at the desk. He picked up the legal pad. He began to read. Outside, the city continued its ordinary life in all directions, indifferent and luminous. And somewhere in it, a midnight black car moved through streets that opened for it as if they'd always known it was coming, carrying a woman who was not looking back, driving toward whatever she had decided to build next in the full, unobstructed light of something that was entirely, finally, her own. And correct about everything, and a clear understanding of exactly how much of what he'd believed about himself had been built on a foundation he hadn't examined. He sat down at the desk. He picked up the legal pad. He began to read. Outside, the city continued its ordinary life in all directions, indifferent and luminous. And somewhere in it, a midnight black car moved through streets that opened for it as if they'd always known it was coming, carrying a woman who was not looking back, driving toward whatever she had decided to build next in the full, unobstructed light of something that was entirely, finally, her own.